It's hard to imagine exactly what the two factions in Constantinople, the Blues and the Greens, were actually like. There's no direct modern-day comparison, but if you can picture the most passionate of football firms, the worst street gangs imaginable, combined with organised crime, you might be getting close. The factions were deeply intertwined with religious and political affiliations. The Blues were generally associated with the ruling class and orthodox religious views, while the Greens were seen as representing more popular working class or dissenting voices, though this was fluid. But the rivalry was serious enough to cause brutal street battles, pogroms, and political upheaval across the empire, not just in the capital. To be part of either faction meant intense loyalty and readiness to defend it violently, as well as using the faction as a platform for political influence and the expression of social tensions. The factions were so powerful that their conflicts directly challenged imperial authority and helped shape the political landscape of Constantinople. Daily life for supporters of the Blues and Greens in Constantinople was deeply infused with their factional identity, which extended far beyond simply attending chariot races at the Hippodrome. These groups were highly organised social factions whose members were recognisable by their distinctive colours, hairstyles and tunics, effectively marking them as part of rival gangs with strong loyalties. On race days, Blues and Greens supporters gathered at their designated stands in the Hippodrome, fervently cheering their charioteers and sometimes engaging in intense and violent confrontations with opposing fans. The atmosphere was electric, with fans even employing supernatural means like throwing curse tablets to sabotage rival chariots. This competitive spirit was so serious that it often spilled into street fights across the city, sometimes resulting in deaths. Supporters also engaged in political activities, sometimes being mobilised by politicians and religious figures to further their agendas, including attacking opponents. For example, members of these factions could serve quasi-political roles, influencing public opinion and instigating or calming riots. As opposed as they were, though, all this is not to say that the factions never united, and on the rare occasions they did, it spelled trouble for someone. In January 532, that someone was Justinian. In 531, following a disturbance after a chariot race, the city prefect, Eudaemon, arrested several members of the Blues and the Greens for murders related to that unrest. Most of those arrested were executed, but on January the 10th, 532, two men, one from the Blues and one from the Greens, survived the execution attempt because the scaffold on which they were to be hanged broke. They escaped and quickly sought sanctuary in the nearby church of St. Lawrence. Both factors then appealed to Justinian to pardon the two men. Justinian, facing other pressing matters such as negotiations with the Sasanian Persians, didn't grant full pardons but commuted their death sentences to imprisonment. It was a compromise, but it was a compromise that satisfied nobody. The factions were already dissatisfied with the emperor's policies, especially regarding taxes and political control, and Justinian's refusal to grant full amnesty just intensified their resentment, especially since both factions had demanded their release. Justinian's decision to deny their plea was perceived as a further act of contempt, fueling the unrest. Long-standing tensions between the Blues and the Greens had often been used by the imperial government to manipulate public order and had been growing unchecked for decades. Justinian had supported this rivalry, strengthening their identities and conflicts. The result was a culture of militant faction pride, with both sides feeling emboldened by Justinian's manipulations and policies supporting their rivalry. The factions' increasing militarization, coupled with their long-standing unchecked power, made their response to Justinian's rejection more violent and organized. On January the 13th, 532, during the chariot races at the Hippodrome, the assembled crowd initially called for the release of the prisoners and expressed displeasure over Justinian's policies. When their demands were ignored, the factions united under the rallying cry of Nika, which means victory. The mood quickly escalated from a sports riot into a full-blown civil uprising. Justinian and his court realized they faced a grave threat. The uprising quickly escalated further into full-scale rebellion against his rule, and the imperial box in the Hippodrome was overrun by rioters. Fearing for his life, Justinian fled with his advisors to the safety of the Great Palace, effectively losing control of the city centre and signalling his vulnerability. The rebels quickly took advantage of the power vacuum to spread chaos. With Justinian temporarily out of the picture, the rebellion intensified rapidly. The mob stormed through Constantinople, burning significant buildings, including the Senate House and the first Hagia Sophia Church. Prisoners were released, law and order collapsed, and the rioters even declared a new emperor, Hypatius, a member of the imperial family, reluctantly supported by both factions. The city was plunged into anarchy for several days, with widespread destruction and fighting. The rebellion all but toppled Justinian's government. This is the point, when Justinian is at his lowest, when the situation seems most hopeless, that Theodora gives her speech. Strengthened by his words, Justinian devises a plan involving his top generals Belisarius and Mundus, along with the eunuch Narses. Narses entered the Hippodrome unarmed and alone, carrying a bag of gold to bribe the leaders of the Blue faction, reminding them that Justinian had been their supporter over the rival Greens. This bribery successfully convinced the Blues to withdraw their support for the rioters during the crowning of the rival Emperor Hypatius. Once the Blues split off from the Greens, Justinian troops, led by Belisarius and Mundus, stormed the Hippodrome. The soldiers slaughtered the rioters, killing as many as 30,000 people, regardless of faction. Hypatius and the other rebel leaders were captured and executed. With this military suppression, Justinian reasserted his control over the city and eliminated political opponents who had sided with the rebels. This harsh but calculated response allowed Justinian to quell the rebellion and save his throne, but it also sent a strong message about the consequences of defying imperial authority, firmly re-establishing order after a period of chaos. The physical destruction in Constantinople after 5 days of rioting was extensive and severe. Nearly half the city was burned or destroyed by fires that spread rapidly through the urban fabric. Key and iconic structures such as the Hagia Sophia, which is the foremost church of the city, the Church of St. Irene, the Baths of Xixippus, the Chalca Gate, the main ceremonial entrance of the Great Palace, and a large portion of the Augustan Forum, including the Senate House, all destroyed. The main paved street, called the Mese, lined with colonnades, shops and porticos, also suffered damage from the fires, although the Hippodrome, the centre stage of the riots, surprisingly escaped any major damage, even though it was adjacent to the palace complex and was the site where much of the violence erupted. This was an urban disaster, leaving large parts of Constantinople in ruins and requiring major rebuilding efforts. With their capital city a smoking half-ruin, Justinian and Theodora saw this as a chance to do more than rebuild. They would remake the city in Justinian's image, making it a grander and more splendid city, something more befitting of the Orthodox Church and the glory of Justinian's reign. Just 40 days after the destruction of the Hagia Sophia, work began on a new church, overseen personally by Justinian, that would not just replace the previous church, but be a structure so splendid, so monumental, that people would regard it as a marvel of architectural beauty and divine inspiration. The church would awe visitors and residents alike, representing imperial power, religious devotion, and the unity of church and state. This quick start to the building suggests that the plans for the new Hagia Sophia were already prepared or nearly completed before the destruction of the old building, enabling fast approval and commencement by Justinian. Those plans were made by two men, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus. There is no clear evidence that they had ever designed or built other buildings before the Hagia Sophia. Their reputations prior to this project were primarily based on their expertise in mathematics and engineering. And yet, in the space of 5 years, these freshman architects created a building that survived earthquakes, invasion, and a millennia and a half of the ravages of time. Justinian's reaction to the completion of the Hagia Sophia in 537 was one of profound triumph and spiritual exaltation. Upon entering the completed church, Justinian is said to stood before the altar and exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." This statement referenced the biblical King Solomon, who built the first temple in Jerusalem, and reflected Justinian's belief that his creation exceeded even that legendary structure in grandeur, and perhaps that he was the better man. Hagia Sophia was to glorify Christianity and serve as the heart of Orthodox worship. Its vast dome, golden mosaics, and imported materials from across the empire embodied religious devotion and imperial power. The fact that it still stands, that you can walk through the same gate as Justinian and the emperors that followed him, you can see, even after all this time, the astonishing achievement this building represents. I honestly believe that Anthemius and Isidore far exceeded their brief. History doesn't record how or even if they were rewarded for their efforts. At the time, projects like this tended to be seen as a result of a group effort guided by the Holy Spirit, so they may not even have received reward at all. It's a real shame that their names aren't better known. Elsewhere in the empire, Justinian was engaged in a similarly ambitious effort to restore the Roman Empire's former glory and broaden its territorial reach. At the beginning of the 540s, the Byzantine Empire was fighting on 3 fronts. Determined to reclaim lands lost to barbarian invasions, Justinian embarked on a series of military campaigns aimed at reconquering parts of the western Mediterranean, fighting the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Persians in the east, and the Visigoths in Spain. Justinian had plenty to be dealing with, and he needed extra problems like he needed the plague, which is exactly what he got. The bubonic plague came to Constantinople around 542 via trade routes from the eastern Mediterranean. It's thought to have originated in or near the Tian Shan mountain range in what is now northern China, then reached the Roman province of Egypt, first arriving at the port of Pelusium near the Red Sea in 541. From Egypt, the plague spread rapidly via merchant ships carrying grain and other goods along Mediterranean sea lanes, reaching Constantinople by the spring of 542. The city's large grain stores, crowded urban population, and the presence of rats and fleas facilitated the rapid spread of the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same pathogen responsible for the Black Death centuries later. This transmission route through maritime trade networks and the urban environment caused catastrophic mortality and social disruption in Constantinople and the wider empire. Justinian took several steps to manage the crisis, but faced significant limitations due to the lack of medical knowledge and the unprecedented scale of the epidemic. His primary interventions included ensuring the burial of the dead to prevent the spread of disease through decomposing bodies, and he also enacted legislation to address social and economic disruptions like inheritance laws for those who died intestate and measures to control prices and wages in response to labour shortages caused by the high mortality. He allowed the church to sell land to pay tax debts, helping stabilise state finances. But quarantine and other effective public health measures were largely absent as the understanding of disease transmission was minimal. Despite these efforts, what came somewhat unfairly to be known as the Plague of Justinian altered the trajectory of Byzantine history and the life of Justinian himself. In 542, Justinian contracted the plague. With him laid low, Theodora governed in his stead. Remarkably, Theodora herself did not get infected, which some historical accounts suggest might have been seen as divine favour or protection. Whatever it was, during the epidemic, Theodora stayed active and in control, maintaining stability in the empire. Justinian survived the plague despite its terrifying symptoms and high mortality due to a combination of luck, robust constitution, and possible access to the best medical care of his time, though Byzantine medical knowledge was rudimentary and largely ineffective against the disease itself. The plague struck quickly and severely, causing fever, chills, delirium, swollen buboes, vomiting, and often death within days. Treatment methods available during Justinian's time were largely based on contemporary medical theories and religious beliefs, but they had no real effect on the bacterial infection. Common treatments included herbal remedies, bloodletting, burning incense to purify the air, and religious ceremonies for divine intervention. As you can imagine, these were largely ineffective against the plague. The emperor likely benefited from focused care by court physicians and isolation, which may have improved his chance of survival compared to the general populace. The plague caused massive death tolls in Constantinople, forcing mass graves and overwhelming the city's ability to cope. Corpses were stuffed into towers with quicklime or loaded onto ships and burned at sea. It's believed that 300,000 people died in Constantinople alone, approximately 50% of the city's population. But Theodora's leadership helped preserve the empire's administrative functions amid the chaos. When Justinian recovered, he, together with Theodora, Belisarius, and other generals and officials, managed the empire's recovery. But the resulting demographic collapse caused by so many deaths and so many people fleeing the empire to places of safety resulted in acute labour shortages, economic disruption, and military depletion. This severely handicapped Justinian's ability to sustain his expansive campaigns, particularly in Italy, where prolonged warfare had already drained resources. Under the leadership of his generals Belisarius and Narses, Byzantine forces successfully retook key regions such as North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of southern Spain from the Visigoths. These campaigns re-established much of the empire's western territories, reviving the illusion of a reunited Roman world. But the protracted wars drained resources and manpower, and holding these reconquered lands proved difficult amid ongoing external threats and internal unrest. Beyond military and economic consequences, the plague compounded fiscal strain on the empire as tax revenues plummeted due to widespread death and reduced productivity. Socially, widespread fear and uncertainty permeated Byzantine society, fueling crises of governance and challenges to centralized authority. The empire's recovery was to be repeatedly hindered by recurrent outbreaks lasting well into the late 8th century. Another of Justinian's grand projects, and one of his most enduring legacies, was completed shortly after the Nika riots: his comprehensive codification of Roman law, a monumental legal achievement that shaped the development of legal systems in the West. The Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law, was a systematic compilation and consolidation of centuries of statutes, legal principles, and juristic writings. It was made up of 4 parts: the Digest, which summarized legal opinions; the Institutes, a legal textbook for students; the Code, a collection of imperial laws; and the Novels, a set of new laws enacted during Justinian's reign. This codification preserved Roman legal tradition and provided a clear, organized framework used by many modern civil law systems. The legal reforms not only strengthened imperial administration, but also reinforced the emperor's authority as the ultimate source of law. After Justinian's recovery from the plague, he and Theodora had a further 6 years together until her death in 548 at the relatively young age of 58. The exact cause isn't known, but the historical consensus is that she died of cancer. Byzantine records at the time tended not to record such things, so we don't really know what Justinian's personal reaction was, but we can infer that the loss of his wife and co-emperor was deeply felt. Despite the political advantages in doing so, Justinian never remarried, and he all but withdrew from courtly sociability, effectively burying himself in his work for the remainder of his life. Theodora, although reviled by Procopius, had a considerable positive influence on the empire and seems to have been held generally in high esteem. She had been instrumental in shaping laws that protected women and marginalized groups, and those reforms endured after her death. She championed laws against forced prostitution, granted women greater rights in divorce and property ownership, and supported protections for actresses and former sex workers. She founded a convent for rehabilitating former sex workers and supported charitable institutions, setting a precedent for imperial involvement in social care. Sadly, while these reforms remained law after her death, the momentum of progress stalled. Without Theodora to champion them, Justinian seems largely to have overlooked any further expansion of women's rights. By the mid-550s, Justinian had completed his western conflicts and the empire stood at its greatest territorial extent since the fall of the Western Roman Empire 100 years before. The Pragmatic Sanction of 554 formalised Byzantine control over Italy, and for a brief time the empire enjoyed a sense of restored Roman unity. Sadly, it wasn't to last, and the Roman Empire would never be so big again. Internal strain from the cost of war, the plague, and administrative overreach caused by the expansion in territory weakened the empire's ability to maintain its gains. Justinian tried to consolidate Byzantine control over Italy, which had been ravaged by decades of the Gothic War, but despite these efforts, Italy remained devastated and economically weakened, with ongoing guerrilla resistance by Gothic factions and incursions by Franks and Alemanni. At the same time, Justinian was forced to maintain his eastern frontier against persistent Persian aggression. The war with Persia dragged on, but he secured a series of truces, a 5-year truce in 545, renewed in 551, and by 561 he had negotiated a 50-year peace treaty. This treaty included annual tribute payments by Byzantium to Persia and ensured Byzantine control over the Christian kingdom of Lazica, securing an important strategic buffer, but it was yet another expense for the impoverished empire to fund. During these final years of his life, Justinian devoted considerable attention to religious policy and theological issues, including controversies about Christ's nature. He issued edicts influencing Christological debates, reflecting his desire to unify the empire religiously. The loss of Theodora had left him politically isolated, and he increasingly withdrew from direct military matters, delegating authority while focusing on law and religion. Justinian's final decade was marked by attempts to rebuild the war-torn provinces administratively and economically, but the legacy of prolonged war and plague made full recovery impossible during his lifetime. The empire faced mounting challenges in maintaining its western territories, despite his ambitious reconquest efforts. He died on November 14, 565, in Constantinople, aged 83, ending a 40-year reign characterized by bold legal reforms, religious activism, and military campaigns that restored much of the former Roman world but left the empire exhausted and vulnerable. While he might be criticized for his often autocratic leadership or for overextending the empire, he is widely regarded as one of the most influential and ambitious rulers of the Byzantine Empire, celebrated for his legal reforms, architectural achievements, and military campaigns. Join me next time when we look at the life of Heraclius, who revitalized the Byzantine Empire through military and administrative reforms, and who ended the long-standing threat of the Persians, only to face a far bigger challenge in the rapidly expanding Arab Caliphate. But for now, thanks very much for joining. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe on your way out, and until next time, whatever you're up to, have a great day.